Hello, and welcome to our podcast that takes the PEA basic writing structure and takes it to that next level. Here we're going to be talking about how to respond to prompts when those prompts contain academic vocabulary in them. And so these prompts are slightly different in that they are asking for very specific vocabulary to be used. And so we wanted to talk specifically about how to respond to this unique type of prompt. And the key here is going to be development. That's going to be the key word you hear us saying over and over again. But let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So first off, a little bit of review. This is our base model that we've been talking about throughout the year. This is the PEA paragraph. You can see a claim, you can see 3 chunks of 3 PEAs, and then you can see a conclusion at the end. We like this because it's a very clear method of organization for academic responses. Again, this isn't for creative writing or poetry or journal writing or something informal. This is going to work well when you're asked to write academic responses, either in short answer form or some sort of longer essay perhaps, or even some sort of multi-page response. Like we said before, this structure comes from the book They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing. And the basic premise of that writing instruction manual is that as writers, we students need to fully understand what a text we are reading is saying first. So that's the reading part. We have to understand what they say, what the text says, what the novel says, what the political cartoon says, and in this case, what the definition says. Then we respond with our own reaction, our own opinion, our thoughts about that text's position in the I say part. So the paragraph, the essay, the dissertation is where we respond to a text or respond to a theory through our academic writing. And so specifically in this case, in this podcast, we're talking about how we must understand the term we are about to discuss before we discuss it. And so here's what we mean with prompts with academic vocabulary in them. So for example, these are typical prompts you might get at a high school level. Explain how the civil rights movement demonstrated the constitutional principle of federalism. So the word is federalism. We would need to know what that is, how it works, what it isn't, in order to properly answer that question. Or number 2, discuss how foreshadowing plays a role in the short story To Build a Fire. Again, the academic term is foreshadowing. We would need to make sure we understand what that term is, how it works, what it isn't, before we start crafting our own response about the short story. Or perhaps an economics term, summarize how each advertisement uses the concept of demand to attract customers. So again, we get these highly specialized vocabulary terms in the prompts. So we as eventual writers need to make sure we understand what these terms are, what they mean, and what they aren't before we start crafting our response. So again, here is that basic structure. You can see the claim, 3 PEA chunks within one paragraph, ending with a concluding sentence. And so behold the addition. Here's where we are adding a layer of complexity to our PEA response. We are going to argue that after we make our claim in response to a prompt, we must include the definition of the academic vocabulary that was used in that prompt. This is where we must provide additional context and that keyword we've been weaving here, development. We must fully develop basically our intro and claim to define the academic vocabulary term that we have been asked about. And so how is this new? Yes, there's a new purple box on our PEA paragraph diagram, but what is that really asking us to do? The prompt is asking us to respond in the context of a given term. So for example, explain how the civil rights movement demonstrated the constitutional principle of federalism. So we're not asked to just respond and say, here's 3 things the civil rights movement did. They had marches, they had sit-ins, they had protests. That is what the civil rights movement did, but does that fully answer the question of how that is federalism? So the new thing is that we must show how all of our PEA chunks answer the 2 parts to that prompt. what the civil rights movement did and how those events show federalism. So again, this is where we need to know what federalism is, or that we need to make sure that we know what the vocabulary term is in regardless of what prompt we're given. And so our analysis section is where we will develop the example back to the definition and back to the claim we originally made. And so we need to focus on two parts of our new PEA structure in order to fully develop our response. One is right near that claim level, right where that purple box is. And so when we make that claim, we need to include our claim, our perspective, our view, our opinion on the topic. But then the key ingredient is the next line, where we must include a short definition of the term you are going to connect to. This is where you embed the they say into your own response. This is where you show your reader that you know what the definition of the term actually means before you go on to share the rest of your paragraph, which is the I say, where you respond to the given prompt and to the given definition. So for example, maybe a claim is, the civil rights movement employed federalism when they used federal troops to integrate public schools. Your next sentence should be a definition of that term. It provides context. It provides development of the academic term. So you might say something like, federalism is the principle of government wherein the federal level retains certain powers over the state governments when there is a dispute. That is what they say. That is what the definition of federalism is. So you have clearly established that you understand what the academic argument of federalism is. Now you're going to make your next PEA chunks examples of how the civil rights movement did things and how those things are federalism, which leads to the second part to fully develop in order to truly connect your writing to these given academic terms. And those are going to be in your analysis section, where two things happen. You're going to explain or summarize what any quotes from the example section might mean. Sometimes they explicitly say the words that connect to your term, but oftentimes they don't. So you might need to explain what your quote actually just said. Then you have to develop that analysis back to the claim and to the definition. And so as you see on the next slides, you can see how these examples fully develop the analysis sections to not only say, yes, here is something they did in the civil rights movement, which is part of it, but more importantly, how that thing they did in the civil rights movement is and meets the definition of federalism, or whatever academic term you are asked to prove. So for example, explain how the civil rights movement demonstrated the constitutional principle of federalism. So maybe our point would be, oftentimes the federal government would use U.S. Army troops to force policies into action. Okay, we are saying that this is something that the civil rights movement did. For example, in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, Eisenhower sent federal troops in to escort the children into the school building. That is a paraphrase. It is evidence of the federal government sending in troops to enforce policy. But now we need to get to the analysis. It is not just we included a piece of evidence and we walk away. This is where we need to connect our evidence to two parts. Number one, that it was part of the civil rights movement, and two, how this evidence shows federalism. So here's the same slide again, but notice how our analysis section has been developed. Rather than just ending with evidence, we have to add that analysis section. And notice how it is developed to include references back to the term of federalism. This act displayed one element of federalism during the civil rights movement, where the federal level utilized its supreme power over a state government to force that state to follow federal law. This exemplified federalism because in this system, the federal government holds the highest authority when there is a dispute between the federal and state levels of government. So we've made our point, we've included our piece of evidence, and then our analysis section now does two things. One, it reinforces that this is something that happened in the civil rights movement, and it connects to how that thing being done connects to the term of federalism. In our analysis, we are constantly tying back and developing and anchoring our idea in the definition that we were asked to define. Here's an example from a literary topic. Discuss how foreshadowing plays a role in the short story of To Build a Fire. So once you understand the prompt, the first part of your response needs to be to make that claim. If the question is discuss how foreshadowing plays a role, your claim is that foreshadowing plays a decisive role in this short story in 3 distinctive sections. That is your claim. That is your response to this prompt, because they're asking you to talk about, does it play a role? And your claim is, yes, it plays a role in these 3 distinctive sections, where each section will be one PEA chunk in your paragraph in a second. But that key second ingredient is the definition. Foreshadowing is when an author places hints about future action into the body of a narrative. That is where you as the writer need to define your term of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing plays a decisive role in this short story when the old man warns the young man not to go out in such cold weather. Okay, that's the writer's point. Now we're going to include some evidence. He said, don't go out, you darn fool. Evidence that we made up. That line doesn't really exist in the short story, but the point is the old man warns the young man. Now, oftentimes students would simply say, here, the old man warns the young man not to go out in such cold weather. You just summarized the evidence. You didn't analyze, you did not connect it to the 2 parts of the prompt, which are A, is this really something that was said in the story? And B, how does this line serve as foreshadowing? You are to explain your analysis of the line as foreshadowing to your reader. Don't worry about giving something away in this case. You can assume that your teacher has read this story. And so it's not like you need to keep it secret like, oh, this is how the story ends. You are showing us your analysis of a line and connecting it, developing it, anchoring it back to the definition of foreshadowing. And so here is an analysis section that is better developed to connect the example back to the point and back to that term you are trying to define. Here the old man warns the young man not to go out in such cold weather. This warning serves as foreshadowing because warnings from wise old mentors often hint at future action in a story. And in fact, this warning does hint at future action because it is indeed the cold that ends up killing the young man, exactly as the previous line had hinted at. So our analysis section deciphers what the quote actually says in case it needs deciphering, and it connects it back to the claim. The claim and point we had made was that this line serves as foreshadowing. So our analysis has to show how this line serves as foreshadowing. And the point of foreshadowing is it hints at future events. So we have to explicitly and clearly develop how this line connects to exactly what happens in the future. And so the analysis section here does just that. It connects how this small little warning, don't go out, you fool, connects to the thing that killed the man later in the story. That proves foreshadowing. And that is a stronger analysis section because it ties back to the academic term in the prompt. And so for the visual learners in the crew, this might be a nice example of what development is. You are on the left. You understand the point you are trying to make because it is tumbling about in your head. But your writing must put all of those complicated things in your head clearly on paper for someone who isn't you. That is your teacher, your assessor. And on the right-hand side, this is your reader who needs to get on the same level of understanding of your thinking. And if you do not develop, if you do not connect the dots, if you do not connect your analysis to the prompt and the term you were given, then you have something like this, where you are on the left thinking you've completely connected. Your reader is over on the right thinking, you know what? They didn't quite connect. And clearly, understanding doesn't happen. So your job is to develop your analysis section. Write enough to clearly prove that the evidence says what it says and how it connects back to the definition of the term you are seeking to define. So that's about it on this stage 2 of our PEA paragraph addition. The PEA paragraph is the strong base model, but when we have prompts that include academic vocabulary that we need to define, we must add that next layer and truly develop our claim sections where we define the terms and our analysis sections to connect back to those definitions that we are trying to prove are actually in play in the prompt and in our response. As always, if you have any questions, please bring those into class. Otherwise, thanks so much, and we will see you soon.